I guess if Mum has a great reputation here, I'm under pressure. But it's lovely to be here. I mean, it's lovely to be in New Zealand since I have been for so long unable to come. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a bird. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find a shelter from the howling spirit and tempest. From the beginning, humans have wished they could fly like a bird. The freedom to fly, to soar above the world and see the world from above. The freedom to go wherever you want, to go wherever you feel like, where the wind blows you. That's what humans have wanted. I considered, while we watched this video, adding another one of humans trying to fly. We have a competition in Melbourne every year, a Birdman competition. You jump off the platform into the river and see how far you can go. It's quite funny, but it's not like this. And actually, the fact that birds can go anywhere is really a problem. Bird flu, we heard of that. And quite to my surprise, coronavirus is not apparently spread by birds, but all the other flu viruses are, and we can't control them because birds do what birds do. And had I been in Melbourne, it's around about now that all of the shearwaters fly away to North Korea and Siberia because that's what they do. You can't stop birds flying. Freedom, that's what the birds have. And from my point of view, one of the amazing things about the birds is they're effectively above the curse. The curse was on the ground. The birds fly in the air. There's a kind of bird in the South Atlantic somewhere that never lands after it takes off. It just flies. I don't know how long it flies for, but it flies. And so humans have always wanted to fly like a bird. All right. Now the Hebrews lived in a very physical world. Clearly I didn't get the message there. Oh, wait. Okay. The Hebrews lived in a very physical world. Their words were anchored in physical reality. When they needed to deal with an abstract concept, they used a physical reality word. So when they talk about hell, they're talking about the ground, the earth. And when they talk about heaven, they're talking about the sky. See, God is in heaven and the birds are also in heaven. Have you ever really thought what that means? Because I grew up thinking of heaven as some other place where God was, but that's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is where the birds are, right here, where we can feel, in the sky. That's where God is. He's not a remote presence. He's a very, very present presence. And when the sky beats on you, it's called the wind, which is the Spirit of God. And every time in the scripture where you read Spirit, you should think wind first, before you think of other things. So let's have a quick look at a good example. Exodus 15. God, this is the song of Moses after they crossed the Red Sea. I'm just going to read a little quote. At the blast of your nostrils, the Spirit, the waters piled up and the flood stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. But God, you blew with your wind, your Spirit. A sea covered them and they sank like lead in the mighty waters. The idea of spirit is intimately associated with being blown by the wind. And that's true throughout the Bible. but we fail to appreciate the physicality of the Spirit, the physical presence of the Spirit in our lives blowing on us. And it says that then God blew them out into the wilderness, language we will come back to. And that actually gives you a really interesting understanding of Genesis chapter 1. So let's go and look at Genesis 1 verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, that's a dreadful translation, but it's in most English versions. The first is that the earth was without form and void. The most modern translations will have wild and waste. The earth was wild and unlivable. And it was dark. And how about this for the next sentence? A divine storm blew over the land. The wind of God blew on the land. No one could live there because it was a hurricane beyond belief. So that's not the only thing the verse means by any means, but you can't read that verse and not think a divine, powerful storm. Now, that's part of understanding the Spirit is physical. And that idea threads through the story of both creation and my story, which is the story of heaven. Because when you hear the kingdom in heaven, I want you to stop and say, no, I'm going to call it now the kingdom in the sky. Because the sky is right here. The kingdom is right here. It's the kingdom in the sky. And it's full of the Spirit of God blowing us around. So we've just looked at Genesis chapter 1, the creation of the first creation, the world Jesus lived in, the kingdom of earth. That's the first creation. Now, let's turn to Matthew chapter 3. The introduction of Jesus' message starts with John, Matthew chapter 3. Repent, for the kingdom of the sky is at hand. This is the one who was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah when he said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. And then I refer you down to what happened in verse 11. John baptized with water, but he said someone else is coming who's going to baptize you with wind and fire. Not spirit, wind, because read what the next verse says. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear the threshing floor and gather his wheat. That's a wind-based activity. You could only do that when the wind would sort the wheat and the chaff for you, and then the chaff will burn, wind and fire. It's not that it's not talking about the spirit, not at all, but first, wind. And heaven is sky. Like God is in the sky, and it's tangible. It's not somewhere else. So let's look for some reinforcements of this. Matthew chapter 2, the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are framed, verse 3 and 10, sorry. Blessed are the poor in the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the sky. And verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of the sky. So the Beatitudes are all about the kingdom in the sky. We'll come back to that idea. But Jesus pushes this idea through the Sermon on the Mount. How about chapter 6, verse 19? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures in the earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in the sky, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Treasures in the sky. How many of you have treasure in the sky? Do you even have any idea what that might be? Clouds, yeah. So that's something for us to think about. We'll come back to that. And how about verse 9? When you pray like this. Our Father in the sky, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in the sky. It's not like any of us have ever figured out how to control the sky. That's kind of the key point, really. And so Jesus is building a real comparison. On the one side, you have the kingdoms of the earth. On the other side, You have the kingdoms of the sky. But what is the sky? What is Jesus meaning? He says, have your treasure in the sky. So let's first of all start by considering the kingdoms of men. The kingdoms of earth, obsessed with boundaries, borders, paperwork to cross the borders, permission to cross the borders, permission to be here as opposed to somewhere else by controlling access to the land, when its dreadful conclusion with the war in Ukraine. The seek to define and control a culture by owning and controlling the land. It matters not if you kill everybody and destroy every building and every living animal, as long as you own the land. And it matters not if that happens as long as you push back. The war in Ukraine is the dreadful endpoint of the kingdoms of earth, the kingdoms of the land. And that obsession with control. And so when Jesus says the kingdom in the sky, the first thing he says, none of those things can matter to you. You have to give up those things and look to the sky. And in the sky, you can't control that you're blown around. There's a common term in the scripture to be blown around by the Spirit. And you've got no control over that. In fact, let's go back and look at it. One of my favorite verses for being blown around by the Spirit, Matthew chapter 4. Jesus was blown by the wind into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Jesus was blown by the wind into the wilderness. You don't have any control. So you're yielding control. The whole point of the kingdom in the sky is you're not in control. The whole point of a kingdom of the earth, whether it's your personal piece of land that you own and paid a mortgage on, or your church that you collectively own, or a country with government and soldiers and military, the whole point is control. I get to decide who's on my land and what they do with it. And Jesus is saying, yield control, because only by yielding control and desire over those things can you find freedom. It's a fundamental challenge to our way of thinking about who we are and what we do. And Jesus always pursued this. Be in the sky, the kingdom in the sky. So it's a kingdom of ideas, a kingdom of ideals, a kingdom that doesn't have fences or boundaries or possessions. It's a kingdom of sharing, a kingdom of generosity and a kingdom of freedom. That then is what Jesus is calling us to. You know, Jesus says something really interesting to Pilate. We'll go to John chapter 18. Jesus is before Pilate. Pilate says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews? What is it that you've done?" Because every single person around Jesus looked at Jesus from the perspective of the kingdom of the earth. He's a politician. What's his agenda? What does he want to control? How do we deal with that? The Pharisees, the disciples, expecting the kingdom to come. They're expecting revolution to grab control of the land. And Jesus is like, nope, totally not interested in that. This is irrelevant to me. I'm interested in your heart. And your heart, the ideas in your mind, is the kingdom in the sky. And Jesus' response says, my kingdom is not of the ground. If my kingdom were of this ground, my servants would fight. Because that's what the kingdoms of the earth are. We fight over control over the land. Jesus said, no, we're not of the land. My kingdom is not from the ground. Or how about this, which I discovered by accident, Matthew chapter 16. Jesus, there's verse 24 of Matthew 16. Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So very obviously a reference to the crucifixion and perhaps Jesus carrying a cross through the streets of Jerusalem. Yeah? No, because the disciples had no idea that was going to happen. They completely rejected that idea when it happened. So what did the disciples think Jesus meant when he said that? I think it's actually pretty interesting, because the disciples would be like, take up your cross and walk. Well, okay, the first clue is cross actually is just a word for fence post. It's not a technical term with a thing. No, it's just a stake in the ground that you put there for a purpose. And what do you put stakes in the ground for a purpose? To build a fence, to show people what's yours and what's not mine, what's mine and what's not mine. Right, a fence, a boundary, a border. And Jesus says, rip them up, walk away from them. That's not where your safety lies. Pull up your fences and give your heart to me, because your security is not in the ground. I'm sure that's what Jesus meant. We look at it now and we see, yes, Jesus went all the way with that to the point of carrying a stake through Jerusalem as a great big demonstration for the Jews of what was going on, which they still didn't completely have any interest in understanding. And then they hung him on it. His whole life was a rejection of the stake. So they hung him on one. One last verse we'll look at, Matthew chapter 8. There's a reason I'm hanging in Matthew, because Matthew, more than anything else, is focused on the question of the dominion of Jesus. The ground versus the sky. Jesus is your rightful king, and he's building the right kingdom. To Matthew 8, verse 20. Jesus said, someone comes to Jesus and says, teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus says, well, foxes have holes. Even the birds in the sky have nests. For me, I got nothing. Because all my treasure is in heaven. So how do you get there? How do you get to have your treasure in heaven? And it's about letting go and saying, you know, it doesn't matter what happens in this world possession-wise. Obviously, our relationships matter. Totally not saying that relationships don't matter. They're critical and important and key. But how much we own, if we own anything, it's a gift from God to be used to build our real treasure, a treasure in heaven. And when you let go of that, when you let go of the idea that you must win in this world, then you can have treasure in heaven, where you identify with your ideals and your ideas and follow Jesus and say, I can build the right relationships. None of it's easy, but the key is to let go. And in letting go is the freedom. Now, you as an ecclesia own a church, just like we do. Why is it more complicated than that? But we have a church. And a church is a tangible kingdom in the ground piece of thing to have. Now, I'm not saying that you should get rid of the church, but you should understand, as we do, try to do, that having a building, having money in the bank, is a millstone around the neck of the ecclesia. It's not that I say you should get rid of it. It's practical. But you should always be aware of that. It's not an asset. It's not an asset for us, and it's not an asset for you. It's a thing that we have to have and we have to deal with having, and we have to minimize the damage, as it were. And because one of the greatest evils in this world is when the church gets involved in the kingdom in the ground. I considered showing you and decided not to, an exhortation given by the Patriarch of Moscow last Sunday, in which he explained that it was necessary to kill all the Ukrainians in order to build the correct Russian society so that everybody could go to heaven. There is no greater evil than when the church gets involved in the kingdoms in the ground. We cannot compromise on that. And the same is for us individually. When we get too involved in the kingdom on the ground, in having property and having possessions and having control, then we're missing the point. We've forgotten what Jesus said, which is none of that matters. It's the kingdom in the sky that matters, but the kingdom in the sky is right here. It's not somewhere else. Yes, it's coming, but it's already here too, because it's in your heart when you decide to let go and focus on the sky and let God blow you around. It's a key point to let that happen. So I call on you now as we take the bread and wine to remember that Jesus set himself free by not caring about the kingdom in the ground. And by so doing, he created the kingdom in the sky. That's the second creation. And as we take the bread and the wine, I invite all of you to let go of the kingdom on the earth and free yourselves to follow Jesus.